Hello and welcome back to History of Philosophy. And this week in Module 11, we're going to take a look at two thinkers who helped to accelerate the final breakdown of metaphysical thinking and systematic thinking. I'm thinking primarily of Arthur Schopenhauer, the German philosopher, and the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. So let's start with Schopenhauer, since he lived first. There is some overlap in their lives, of course. But Schopenhauer lived and taught in Berlin, and he worked actually at the same time as Hegel did, who was also living in Berlin. In fact, Schopenhauer set up his lectures to coincide with those of Hegel's, and never really attracted that many students, since Hegel was really the one philosopher to follow. But Schopenhauer still stuck to his guns, and he did lecture. Didn't have too many students, but one of them was Friedrich Nietzsche, who is also very, very important in this final breakdown of systematic and metaphysical thinking. So what did Nietzsche and other students find interesting about Schopenhauer's work? Well, the first thing is this idea that ultimate reality is Wille, right? The will or desire. And the world that we create is the world that we desire. We want that will that we have within us to realize a world in which we fit in, a world that we're at home in. And Nietzsche, as we'll see next week, took this idea even further. And he called it a will to power. And it's not a power in a political sense, although there are certainly arguments to be made on both sides, but a notion that we are in control of our own lives, that we create or should create the reality in which we would like to live. So it starts with Schopenhauer, that Wille, the will, creates that ultimate reality. And Nietzsche takes even further, that it becomes our motivator, right? The power behind our actions. And Hegel, on the other hand, would have looked at both of these characters as somehow almost atheistic, because this kind of idea you wish to infer to God. God really is the one that has the power. But Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard less so, but Schopenhauer and later Nietzsche certainly were individuals who stood their ground, who said, no, I don't need an exterior power. I don't need anyone else but myself. I'm not going to claim that it's going to be easy. It won't. Life is a struggle. It's a jihad. That's what it is. It's overcoming obstacles. But Schopenhauer's vision was one that was a model that was very influential and lasted a good long time, because that rather pessimistic view of the world was one that was becoming more popular, or people were becoming more aware of it, that things maybe weren't going in the direction that we were being told, that science and technology and art were all going in the direction of greater and greater amounts of freedom. The question is, whose freedom? And if we're going to be talking about an individual living in that particular society, what happens to our instinctual nature, right? Our notion of freedom. What is that going to look like? And can I actually be free? And if I am, what will my Wille look in that particular ultimate reality, where there is, on the one hand, rational freedom, and on the other hand, the ability through our will to change that. One of Schopenhauer's most famous statements, as you can imagine, was, life is not worth living. And of course, it wasn't meant to be, kill yourself right now. It isn't. It's actually the opposite. The idea is to instill the opposite response. And so Schopenhauer is trying to wake people up, right? He's trying to, of course, one of the first philosophers to use exclamation marks in his philosophical statements, something that Nietzsche picks up and really becomes the sort of the arbiter of this kind of thinking. A lot of declamatory statements and interrogative statements, not calm and cool and disinterested and objective, quite the opposite. Very much an individual living in the world, in a reality that they may not be very happy about, but they are living in a particular world, in the Western world, for example, and are following ideas from Western philosophy. And the idea that the human body, right, the human subject, is something, again, that becomes more and more important. And I would argue to the point where the individual eventually shatters metaphysical thought and systematic thought and replaces it. So it takes a period of time. It takes about 200 years roughly for these ideas to come to fruition. So it's Schopenhauer who, again, moves this idea along, moves this train along by declaring the materiality, the life of the body, right, rather than the mind. Now, who should that remind us of? Descartes, right? We're not Cartesian individuals who operate only using our minds and having thoughts. No, we are sensual beings. We have desires, passions, feelings, wills, right? How's it going to fit in if we're just going to look at the world as a mind, as a thought experiment? Reality is not a thought experiment. It is something to be lived within and, if possible, changed for the better. So materiality, right, the life of the body, the existence of the body, the existence of the subject rather than the mind, becomes this driving force for existence, right? The driving force for a way of thinking about the world. Now, Schopenhauer does have some antecedents, right? Some historical roots, going to, according to some people, all the way back to Heraclitus. This idea of a pessimistic view of the world. Epicurus, not so much, because he tended to be more optimistic. But certainly Heraclitus could be kind of deep and profound, yet pessimistic at the same time. But it was always a call to arms. It was a call not to accept your fate. Exactly the opposite. This is what Kierkegaard, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and others that we'll see in the 20th century are asking us to do. Not to accept our fate, not to simply settle for what is going on, but no, if the world is pessimistic, do something about it. And if we think back even to Marx, right, the idea of a philosopher is not to interpret the world, but to change it. Now, Schopenhauer was not a Marxist, in fact, was writing before Marx, but the ideas are already there in the air, right? In the marketplace of ideas is, yes, an increasingly pessimistic worldview brought on by industrialization, senses of social alienation and social enemy. But at the same time, that's not an admission of failure, right? It's an admission that we can change the world, that we need to know the truth about existence, and that truth is that we can change it. And Schopenhauer was brutally honest with the way the world was. And he wasn't about to make it pretty, tie it up in a little pink bow and make it digestible and presentable. It wasn't a sugar-coated pill. No, the truth may hurt, but the truth is also the tool that you will need to make things better. Now, Schopenhauer certainly is one of the few, Kierkegaard a little bit, to really be brutally honest about what it meant to be a human being. And suicide and death were not things that we should celebrate. I mean, they are part of life. But Schopenhauer was not a suicidal person, pessimistic and depressed in that way. He wasn't anxious. He may have been pessimistic, but he knew that he could do something about it. And so death is something that we shouldn't fear. Now, that should sound like Epicurus, because he kind of thought the same way. Epicurus was a post-Aristotelian thinker who existed between the beginning of the Roman Empire and the death of Aristotle. So this kind of thinking, death is simply not something to be feared. It's just part of who we are. This is our end point. So that kind of thinking is certainly historically there. If you look back to the history of philosophy, these ideas are there. And he writes in The World as Will and Representation of Volume 2, quote, "Thus the fear of death, which holds us firmly to life in spite of all its miseries, is really illusory. And just as illusory is the impulse that has enticed us into it." In other words, don't give up. Keep fighting, keep struggling, keep moving forward. And as a quote says here, every man takes the limits of his own field of vision for the limits of the world when it clearly is not. Now, this is not or should not be considered as a kind of economic imperative. Be the one with the most amount of toys at the end of your life, or go out and make the most amount of money. No, it is to live a fully authentic life. This is what he was asking us to do. So that ethical world that Schopenhauer lives in is one in which it's a struggle. Very few times are things calm enough to say, I've succeeded, because all that really happens is it's a temporary reprieve. before the next obstacle comes up. And if you really think about your life, we have many different kinds of obstacles, some great, some very small, some almost insignificant, but each day we have various kinds. And so we need to be able to prioritize the ones that matter, right? The ones that you're willing to die on that hill for versus the ones that you just look at and go, you know what? Don't sweat the small stuff. Rise above it. So Schopenhauer's ethical world, the only thing that's worth doing is struggling to make things better, to get a better life. So if there is what could be called a heroic life project, really it's not that, right? No one's asking to be a hero. Be a hero in your own mind. Be proud of the things you've accomplished rather than waiting for something to happen. Well, we cannot rely on others. We need to be able to do things for ourselves. And of course, within the letter of the law, you still have to be ethical beings living in society. There is a limit. And Nietzsche, we'll look at next week, pushes that limit absolutely as far as it can go. So Schopenhauer is a philosopher for young folks, young people. That was many years ago for me. But he is a thinker for people who are just kind of starting out, right? Just kind of on the cusp of adulthood. Because you look at so many different things, everything is all powerful, all of it's important. You need to prioritize. You need to make sense of the world. You need to really be aware of your existence and be existential about it. And really, Schopenhauer is one of the early proponents of this kind of thinking. We can go back to some parts of Hegel's ideas, mutual recognition, the master-slave dialectic, and things like that. Marx as well, the idea of the living human being, that species being. These are all ideas that are in the air, right? This reconstituting, or perhaps even constituting for the first time, the true individual subject living in a society. So many of the ideas that Schopenhauer presents to us move along that line, right down that trajectory of the individual that does not wish to be manipulated, but certainly can be socialized to a certain degree, but not socialized to the point of being just a member of the herd, right? The sheeple, as we call them today. No, Schopenhauer doesn't want us to be that. But again, he's not asking us to be some kind of radical, anarchic individual. We need to live with other people, but we also need to live with ourselves. And if we are self-conscious and we are introspective and we think about our lives, there are things that we can change. Now, Schopenhauer also, and this is the re-embodiment. And again, some people say the embodiment for the first time, but let's say the re-embodiment of the human body, right? The sexual organs of the human body, what brings people together. And whoever it is that is your significant other, those sexual organs bring you together. And that kind of thinking should be celebrated. Schopenhauer is saying, look, we're people, we're human beings. We're not abstract entities. We're not things. We're human beings. We're subjects. And we have passions and desires that bring us together and repel us as well. But think of the sexual organs as, he says, the true center of the world. I mean, this is a radical thinking, right? This is unlike anything that we've heard up to this point. And rationality is a kind of veil that sort of is placed over top of this kind of sort of body and earthy sort of thinking about the human condition. Rationality for Schopenhauer is just this kind of covering that tries to stifle or diffuse in some way that will to live, that will to desire, and eventually for Nietzsche, that will to power. And again, I need to clarify will to power not in a political sense, but the power you have to change your life for the better. Okay, so Schopenhauer, knowing full well that these ideas are sort of in the marketplace of ideas of his own, knows that the philosopher can be a very dangerous member of society. Those kinds of ideas are going to stir people up, right? Get them motivated, get them thinking, get them contemplating, get them reflecting, and ultimately get them changing the world, not interpreting, but changing the world, like Marx would say roughly around the same time, a few years later. But again, there's no clear connection between Schopenhauer and Marx other than this idea of changing the world. That's what they have in common. Now, the philosopher will be asking questions, about the world, about our relationship to the world, but ultimately we're asking, what does it mean to be a human being? Are we an abstract entity? Are we an empty stomach? Are we a living, authentic human being with desires and motivations and wills that are either stifled, depending on where we live, or allowed to come to fruition because we live in a free society? So he says, the truth dare not appear naked before the people. So he is talking about how religion is also like rationality, a kind of veil, right? That diffuses that kind of independent thinking. So hopefully you can kind of start hearing just through the language that I'm using, how Schopenhauer and others keep pushing back on metaphysics, keep pushing back on systematic thinking, because we're not systems, right? We're human beings, and systems break down. Systems can be faulty. Systems can think independently. Absolutely, right? Dare to think for yourself is something that Kant had said back in the 1780s, roughly. And the same kind of ideas going on. That first principle, right? The prima philosophia that Schopenhauer was really adamant on presenting in his theories and in his concepts is the notion to dare to think for yourself. This is something that, although Kant is considered an idealist, is considered an idealist, this is something that he gave us in his kind of non-metaphysical thinking, non-idealist thinking. Kant, compared to Hegel, really still has his feet on the ground, and he can be critical of pure reason. And critique of pure reason does exactly that. And when Kant talks about enlightenment, which is that period of time just before Schopenhauer that leads into the French Revolution, the American Revolution, industrialization, the Scottish Enlightenment, all this kind of thinking, Kant is swept up in this. And he says, right, dare to think for yourself. Make that your founding principle. And that is what we want to do. And that's what Schopenhauer also wanted us to do. So whatever it may have been in the past, we were kind of dressing it up with all kinds of different fictitious garbs, the natural order, Darwin's system of evolution, isms of one sort or another. No, it's a simple idea. Dare to think for yourself. Now, if we are going to be thinking this way, what direction do we move in, right? How do we bring that first step moving forward? And if we can simply think of the pursuit of happiness, now, if you were to ask Hegel the same question, he would say greater and greater amounts of freedom, because that is just as important as happiness. But Schopenhauer kind of, when we talk about freedom, it sounds like social freedom or freedom given to us by institutions. And Schopenhauer says, no, it's already too abstract. It's us. It's we as human beings. So the pursuit of happiness becomes something really important. So as we are doing this, we want to make sure that we are capable of acting upon those principles. And we want to make sure that what we are doing will certainly help us. But Schopenhauer at no point says, if we harm people, if we hurt people in the process, oh, that's completely good. No, that becomes something that Nietzsche will flirt with later on. And we talk about him next week. But Schopenhauer had this equally bizarre way of looking at happiness as just a momentary thing, right? As we overcome these obstacles, as we struggle in our own jihad, right? Our struggles and obstacles and overcoming them, in between, right? That little valley in between these mountains is what he calls happiness. It's short-lived, but it's conquered and it's ours, right? Because we accomplished it. So with all of that, Schopenhauer asks, right, is life worth living? Well, of course, right? Life is worth living because it's a life of compassion. It's a life of humanity. It's a love of humanity. And both of those are examples of a kind of ethical life, which is very much grounded in that ultimate reality, right? The reality as expression of the will, right? The world as will and idea. And so if we can do that, we end up with a world that is still somewhat compassionate. So in the basis of morality, he writes, the principle, which we discovered to be the final explanation of ethics, now in turn itself requires explaining. so that our present problem has to deal with that natural compassion, which in every man is innate and indestructible, right? So compassion is something we have innately, and which has been shown to be the sole source of non-egoistic conduct. So egoistic conduct, self-centered conduct, is not necessarily a good thing in Schopenhauer's books. So when we talk about ethics, we need to focus in on compassion. So we may see others who are, who have fallen by the wayside, who might need our help. And absolutely, under all conditions, Schopenhauer says, go ahead and do that. There's nothing wrong with helping people, but we need to make sure we don't lose sight of that sense of compassion that he says is innate, right? It is innate in all of us. So life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, that's John Locke. Add to that compassion, that's Schopenhauer. So all of these feelings are important for us to have. Now, one exception to the rule, rational thinking, where we think objectively about an object, whether it's a thought experiment or whether we're thinking about geometry because we're Platonists, says no. There's one exception to the rule of that kind of thinking, and it's introspection. So introspection, looking within, right, is to allow me to see what is inside of me, what is in me, what is accessible to me alone. And if we can delve within ourselves, this is going beyond self-consciousness, right? We are, first of all, conscious beings. We become self-conscious of the surrounding world, of that reality we live in, and those that live in it, right? In that same reality. Because remember, Schopenhauer wishes us to have compassion. And that introspection that goes beyond self-consciousness is almost an enhanced version of it. And of course, Hegel talked about that. Introspection is that authentic path of the will within me, right, towards the will. So as we tap into ourselves and the will that we have, coupled with the compassion that we have, introspection will allow us to hone in on it, right, to find it and to grasp it as a critical tool moving forward. Now, Nietzsche would talk about suffering in similar ways, but his antidote was not necessarily introspection as it was, again, will to power, the will to overcome. And again, will to power, not as a political slogan, although many people have used it as such, but a will to change the world. So Schopenhauer's will to live and Nietzsche's will to power is perhaps one of the most authentic and powerful statements about the individual subject living in the world, not thinking about the world or thinking about some kind of existence beyond the world or beyond physical reality. No, it is us living in this world here and now, and who have control over our lives. So with all of that, Schopenhauer's hoping that will to live will allow for the creation of a more humane world, a less pessimistic world. But we cannot lie to ourselves. We know that it's going to be difficult, and human beings cannot live without lies. Sometimes that mythology that individuals grasp and move towards, it will lie to us, but we cannot live these intentional falsehoods forever. At one point, we need to call them out for what they are, right? Through introspection, we realize that lies may be there to hide the truth in a sense that maybe the truth is too difficult and too pessimistic. Well, no, any kind of deviation from that truth, right, that we find through introspection, we need to make sure that we never lose sight of that. So introspection is an awareness of the lies that are there in the first place. We can now separate those falsehoods from those truthhoods, I guess, or the truth. If we can do that, then obviously we aim for the truth, and we try to deal with the lies and recognize them as such. So Schopenhauer was really concerned with the fact that human beings must be aware that suffering will happen. Suffering is not a sign of failure. It's a sign of being alive, right? We're not abstract individuals. And so inescapable suffering is going to happen. And the very existence of the will crash headlong into things. And if you think back to Hegel, right, the spirit is this this entity sparring, tearing with the negative. Same kind of ideas happening with Schopenhauer. But here, it isn't spirit, it's us. It's us tearing, right? Struggling with the negative. And so this will happen. If you spend an entire lifetime without struggle, you haven't really lived. That's what Schopenhauer is implying. So we know that we will suffer in various ways. There will be different kinds of obstacles that are in our way, and we need to address them and overcome them. And so the very awareness, the very existence of the will, and using the will in the world, by its very nature, you will find obstacles. You will suffer. So we can't turn around and sit in the corner of our rooms like Descartes or even Hegel for that matter and use these sort of metaphysical or ideal powers of the mind to fix the problem, because all you manage to do is fix the problem theoretically. In practical terms, the problem's still there. All that's happened is you've worked out a kind of solution that is adequate, but you haven't really done anything, right? You haven't moved into the world. You haven't struggled, and you haven't faced the world in some way. So to suffer and experience obstacles is not a sign of failure. It's a sign that you understand that you have a will that desires to be expressed and will come up against certain obstacles. And I know I keep repeating myself, but this is not one in which others are harmed. Remember, Schopenhauer qualifies this kind of thinking with compassion, right? That is what we need to remember. So individuals live within a context, right? In this day and age, it's kind of late capitalist context. We live obviously in societies. We cannot live outside of a society. And so historical conditions, yes, are important, and that will change over time. But Schopenhauer says, regardless, we need to make sure that we are aware that we do have a will, that the moment we express it, it will come up against some kind of an obstacle. So we will tarry with the negative no matter what. So that war against nature ends, right, when we are fully responsible. We have created a condition that we are living in a world that we have created, that has not been created for us or has not always been there, but instead it is a human condition that we have created for ourselves, and we are resigned to the world. So Schopenhauer is talking about abstract entities like Homo sapiens as opposed to actual authentic human beings, subjects living in the world, as homo generators. And the homo generator, right, that generates something, is the one who realizes in reality the world in which they want to live. And all of this is done through the will, right? The world as will and idea, which is the title of his book. So if you ignore it, if you turn a blind eye to it, then you really have no one to blame but yourself. So this is a kind of philosophy that really says you are in charge of your own life. There are no abstract entities, no metaphysical dimensions that you can rely on and blame at a later point. This kind of thinking too is very similar to the ancient Greeks, who realized that mythology no longer answered those questions that they were now posing. And Schopenhauer looks at metaphysics in much the same way, that the kind of philosophy he's doing is much more grounded almost in sociology and psychology than it has to do with philosophy in some kind of a proper sense of the word. So he says, no, it is the homo generator who realizes in life how to live more authentically in some better way that we're at now. Now, he at no point said this can be done overnight. It can take many centuries for this to happen. And as long as we are on the right track and creating a more humane world, then we are at least moving in the right direction. So he writes, in World as Will and Idea, I know of no greater absurdity than that propounded by most systems of philosophy in declaring evil to be negative in its character. Evil is just what is positive. It makes its own existence felt. So evil exists. No little part of the torment lies in this, that time is continually pressing upon us, never letting us take breath, but always coming after us like a taskmaster with a whip. If at any moment time stays his hand, it is only when delivered over to the misery of boredom. So we have philosophical systems who declare evil as some component of this philosophical system. And Schopenhauer says, no, of course there's evil in the world. We know that. But we can fight against it using compassion, introspection, harnessing the will to create a better world. And the whole time we're doing this, let's remind ourselves, right? We're doing it on a limited budget and a limited time scale. So time is always pressing down on us, right? We can't sit back on our laurels and, maybe a couple times a year might do something like this, to try to move things forward. No, time is going to be constantly eroding and working on you and saying, look, you're running out of time, or you got to make this happen. And so time is something that is looked at as a component that is very much in the everyday, rather than saying, well, there's birth and death, and in between is some stuff. Well, Schopenhauer says that's some stuff I just mentioned. No, that's life. That's what is worth living. So any kind of system of philosophy that talks about these aspects of life, like evil in the abstract, is not really being honest. Evil is just what it is, right? It makes its own existence felt. It's there, and we need to not embrace it, but we need to be aware of it. We need to acknowledge its existence. And evil sometimes is simply the eroding of that wille into something else, right? It derails its ability to do its work. Okay, so that's Schopenhauer. The other thinker that I wish to talk about here is Kierkegaard. And he is also someone who is responding directly to Hegel. And here we have Hegel's system that we talked about 2 weeks ago, as saying that it's historical, it's retrospective, it looks at things after the fact, it doesn't try to change the world. It's sort of philosophy in a rearview mirror, if you want to call it that. And Kierkegaard, really, much like Schopenhauer, argued a very similar idea, which is that there is no proper account of human actions, because the overriding concern for Hegel was spirit, right? Was Geist. And what is spirit? But the culmination of all of these institutions and aspirations that humanity is part of and creates. But in so saying that, in so doing, spirit now has forgotten the human motivator, right? The homo generator that has created these things. So Hegel is more concerned with spirit as an entity on its own, as a kind of metaphysical entity, than he is in all the human actions that have created this thing in the first place. So any kind of action that is not human is not something that Kierkegaard was willing to look at. If we're going to talk about anything, we're going to be talking about individuals, in any kind of systematic thinking, metaphysical thinking, any sort of philosophy that does not take a proper account of human action is not a philosophy at all. And so, in the same way as Schopenhauer talks about the will, talks about compassion, talks about introspection, Kierkegaard talks about existence, right? Existence in Danish, and existence he contrasts with reason. And he contrasts that to the concept, the idea, anything that exists in that metaphysical world, right? Concepts are ideas about the world. They're ideas that help to explain the world. Ideas the same, especially capital I ideas, which would be coming from Plato, because Kierkegaard and Schopenhauer were not Platonists by any stretch of the imagination. So existence is paramount. Existence, authentic existence especially, is the end goal of Kierkegaard's philosophy. So existence for Hegel was not associated with human existence, human social life even, but no more advanced intellectual categories, metaphysical, systematic categories. So existence is the existence of systems for Hegel. For Kierkegaard, it's the existence of human beings who create those systems in the first place, create the institutions in the first place, and trying, as difficult as it may be, to keep sight of that. Now, there is a very important difference between Kierkegaard and Schopenhauer, which is Kierkegaard's view of religion. Because contemporary religion, for Kierkegaard, was something that was really losing its luster, its purpose in society. Because for Kierkegaard to really believe, right, you need to allow religion to touch you, right, to touch individuals to their deepest core. Because if you don't let religion do that, because that is its purpose, then it's not really a religion. So those who just decide to go to church on a Sunday, or maybe a couple times a year, or when they visit their parents, and the rest of the time they don't, that kind of religious hypocrisy is just the very thing that Kierkegaard thought was the end of religion, because people really didn't believe. They just behaved, right? They just behaved in a particular way and appeared to be believers when in fact they weren't. It was just part of what they did on a weekend. Sunday, we go to church, or Saturday we go to the temple, or wherever it is that we're going. You need to allow that religion to get to the very core of who you are. Otherwise, you can't really call yourself a true believer. But even though we're talking about religion, it's about living authentically. So even though religion is a component of life, it too needs to be lived authentically. It needs to be believed authentically. So you can see here, when we're talking about authentic forms of living, this is the beginnings of what we will see in a couple of weeks to be that existentialist impulse. We see it in Kierkegaard. We'll see it with the existentialist thinkers in a couple of weeks. We talk about Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. And this is where we start thinking about real things, authentic things. But for Kierkegaard, he's not willing to give up religion. He wants to see a real religion, a contemporary religion that is meaningful to people's lives. So how does he do this, right? Well, he decides to move forward in the world. And one of the ways in which he does it, he presented himself with what he called an either-or situation, right? Either I'm going to move in this direction or that direction. And so at a very early age, he decides, well, I have a choice, right? I can either marry my sweetheart, Regina Olsen, there's a picture of her there, and live, a boring middle-class kind of existence, which is certainly not awful, but it's one where, in the eyes of Kierkegaard and others, it's kind of giving up too easily, right? That's what they want to do. Or do you want to seek out, right? This is your or, so either one or the other. The or, seek out to serve in faith. But again, authentic faith. So for him, the first thing he chooses to do is to make modern life not less difficult, but in fact, more difficult. So that the things that would be easily given to him, he's got to fight for, he's got to struggle for. So he, instead of making life easier, makes life more difficult for himself by living as a philosopher, living as a thinker, rather than someone just living a middle-class existence, and whether they're working in a factory or working somewhere else in an office as a bureaucrat. This would be considered a boring middle-class life. And that's not what Kierkegaard wanted. He said either or. So he chose the seeking out of to serve in faith. And so that made life, obviously, as you can imagine, much more difficult. Now, in doing all of this, Kierkegaard was also one of the very first critics of modernity that really sort of honed in on some of the problems with living in a modern world. And of course, he's writing in this sort of the middle of the 19th century. So there is not the degree of industrialization that we have in the beginning of the 21st century, or even throughout the second half of the 20th. But there is this notion that human progress might be a little bit of an illusion. Could be one of those veils, right, that gets placed over society or placed over our way of thinking that is not allowing us to see things clearly. So Schopenhauer wanted us to think clearly, think authentically. So did Kierkegaard. And for Kierkegaard, humanity's alleged progress, right, was a kind of illusion, because we have mass market newspapers and mass market, appealing to the lowest common denominator in people, almost to the level of populism. And so appealing things to the masses kind of generally bores everyone. There's no struggle in thinking. There's no enlightenment involved. There's no real kind of improvement in one's life. You're just reading a newspaper or magazine because you're bored, right? Because you want to be entertained. Entertainment's fine, but when it is appealing to the lowest common denominator of the masses, which is what mass thinking means, it kind of makes life really drab, right? Because if you can be above that, you're not going to find it very appealing. So humanity is kind of dehumanizing itself. It's robbing itself of its individuality. And anyone that stands out at this point really ends up being almost ostracized by society. So to be an individual is this kind of precarious balancing act between being an individual, but not being so utterly singular and so utterly different that people don't know how to deal with you. They don't know how to approach you. It's either your behavior, your manner of speaking, the way you dress, what you do or don't do. It is, on the one hand, trying to say that I am an individual thinker because that's my philosophy, but you want to do it in such a way that you're not so utterly disconnected from the rest of society. This is a difficult balancing act because Kierkegaard and Schopenhauer before were asking us to be individuals, right? To harness that will and create the world that we want. Now, if we don't do that, right, we're going to lose the very thing that makes us human. And this is certainly an idea in philosophy that has been around for quite some time. When philosophers do in fact address the individual, it's something that if we understand what it is that makes an individual, we want to make sure we never lose sight of it. So it was science and industry and technology that was really kind of sapping the humanity or the humanness out of individuals. And the end result is that people now get sort of collapsed into categories, right? And again, this is not an authentic form of living. I am a subject. I am a citizen. I am a consumer. Those are categories, right? They don't say who the individual is, simply what they're doing or their relationship to the state. These kinds of categories become really predominant in sociology and political science, of course. And so the result is that the individual loses their humanness, right? What makes them unique. So the uniqueness of a person, again, becomes a kind of balancing act between being able to strike out on your own as a unique individual, but not losing your common social roots with other people. So if we can become aware of the way in which science has created this sort of detached, objective, universal, and logical kind of world, yes, those are the very forces that tend towards abstraction, right? They tend towards creating individuals who are not really individuals, but these collapsed categories of subject, citizen, consumer, right? That's not who we are. And if that is all we can be, then we have lost our humanity. And Kierkegaard says, this is what was wrong with Hegel's system. It's responsible for, on the one hand, at least the acknowledgement of modern individuals, but always lumped into this huge category of, mass man is what he called most people. All right. So mass man or common man, John Q. Public, whatever you want to call these people, that's not who we are. And Kierkegaard was deeply concerned with the fact that the notion of mass groups of people really reduced us to either categories or reduced our humanity in some way. So, along with viewing science and technology and rationality as existing, but not always moving towards a kind of progress that would qualify human progress as a good thing, because that's not what they're concerned with. They're really concerned with themselves, right? Technology is concerned with technology, science with science, and so on, rather than with making human life better. And so Kierkegaard thought that if that's the case, then perhaps the way in which we think and the concepts that we use to think, maybe that's where the problem is. Maybe philosophical systems are at fault. So right in a sense from the ground up, the age of philosophical systems really kind of gets to its absolute apex, right? The very top point of a triangle, for example. At the very top of the triangle of systematic thinking is Hegel. And there he is. Some thinkers will present their ideas in sort of somewhat unsystematic forms. Feuerbach, we looked at last week, He was not a systematic writer, and some individuals think that that was one of his downfalls, but that was not his intention. He wasn't trying to build a philosophical system. He was trying to break one down because he too was concerned with the individual. So last week, this week, and next week, we'll see how that individual becomes more and more important as the individual pushes aside metaphysical thinking for ethics, right? Choices. So the two greatest critics of Hegelian system building and the scientific systems were in fact Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. And this is where Nietzsche really gets his ideas about dissolving away these systems. So we can look at, there's 5 things that are really sort of part and parcel of this comprehensive critique of systematic thinking. The first one is the fact that the social world is far too complex, right? And knowledge is too vast to be accommodated into one single system, whether it's called spirit or whether it's called idealism or whether it's some Platonic system. No, the social world, the economic, the political, the cultural, the human world is far too complex to fit into one single system. There's too many things going on. That's one. The second is, by its very nature, a system, as it tries to create itself, is of course limiting and restrictive. Because if you look in the first one, right, the social world is too complex. At the very least, reductionism is going to be something you are going to have to worry about. Because as we force things into categories and force ideas and behaviors and existences into a limiting and restricting system, we know that we're going to close off all kinds of our alternatives. And finally, the system itself will only reflect certain parts of the world, certain aspects of reality. And is that a comprehensive system? No, it's not. The third one is that a system is cognitive and retrospective rather than practical and prospective. In other words, a system can only be built after the fact, right? It's cognitive of certain patterns of behavior, and once it collects enough data, it can retrospectively create a system looking, again, through that rearview mirror. And Kierkegaard is saying, no, Schopenhauer and I are moving forward, right? We're moving into the world, not looking backwards to what has happened. So a system that is practical and prospective is perhaps a better one. And even the word system should be used in quotations when we're talking about a practical and prospective system. Because human choices made within society and human choices that are based on the will and its expressive actions thereof, right, are not part of the system. Those actions have to have already occurred for the system to come into place. So systems need to be, if at all, need to be practical and prospective. In other words, what's coming up? 4, a system really in the end is groundless because it really just expresses the personality of the systematizer. So whether it's Plato or it's Descartes or whether it's Hegel, that system ultimately, as much as Hegel said, no, it's subjective. No, you cannot step outside of yourself, right? You cannot say that I'm going to be objective because there are blind spots in our ways of thinking that ultimately make those systems groundless, right? Because they're simply a reflection of the thinker. That's all it is. And finally, a system cannot accommodate the reflectiveness of the human mind, right? Why even have a system to ask the question, why have a system, cannot happen inside of a system. It has to happen outside. The moment you do that, you're not within it anymore. The system begins to break down. So he writes in Either Or, experience has shown that it is by no means difficult for philosophy to begin. Far from it. Indeed, it can begin with nothing. So it can always begin, literally anywhere. On the other hand, the difficulty for philosophy and philosophers is to stop. Thus, I have avoided this problem, for insofar as anyone might believe that when I stop now, I stop. Then he shows that he does not have the speculative concept in mind. So, philosophy can start literally at any point. The problem is to stop it, because if it's about life, until we expire, it's going to constantly keep moving forward. So if you wish to stop at a certain point, you certainly can, but that doesn't mean that life ends with it. Life goes on. Life moves on beyond that system, beyond that philosophy. So along with Nietzsche, Kierkegaard is really a critique or a critic of systematic thought and systems in general, because systematic thought can't deal with contingencies. And what are contingencies? They're obstacles. They're problems. They're unforeseen problems. And a system is allegedly supposed to be able to deal with unforeseen problems. But guess what? The moment something like that happens, the system is now, it's in peril, right? It's going to be threatened in some way. So systematic thought cannot deal with contingencies because they are by their very nature, the latter, by their very nature, problems that were unexpected. And yet that's exactly what a system is supposed to do, right? It's supposed to predict all this kind of behavior. So contingencies happen by chance, without any known cause sometimes, accidentally, but these are the very things that we need to struggle against in order to be able to overcome them. So they can be contradictory, problematic, but any kind of contingency will eventually destroy a system because the system has not been able to recognize it as such. It hasn't even seen it. It hasn't considered it. It hasn't incorporated it because it was looking for patterns. And what is a contingency? Something that lies outside the pattern. So a system can only be built up on consistent and predictable patterns. Human life is not that. Schopenhauer says so, and Kierkegaard says so. It is not a predictable road that we travel from birth to death. It's full of contradictory and problematic issues that we need to be ready to deal with. What is good for that? Not the system, but the will, right? The will is what creates those contingencies in the first place. So we can't place the will at the center of a system. It's just not possible because the will comes from desire. It comes from preoccupations. It comes from impulse. That's not something we can systematize. It's very, very difficult. So the will acts immediately and produces those contingencies, those obstacles, because now we're trying to move not in a way that's simple, right, but in a way that's difficult, a way that's less easy, right? It's the road less traveled. And the road less traveled is obviously going to be one with obstacles. And so that is always going to be the road that lies outside any form of systematic thought. So those contingencies provide the materials which Kierkegaard begins to theorize about. But those contingencies are what theory needs in order to make sense. So as much as Hegel uses reflection to look backwards through the rearview mirror, Hegel's system can only make sense after the fact. But that's not human life. We don't have eyes in the back of our heads. We have them in the front of our heads. And we move forward, right? We think about the future. So Hegelian philosophy is about the real world after the fact, a posteriori. That's what it means, after the fact. So contingency is something that is accidental, but Hegel doesn't deal well with those. He can resolve contingencies theoretically, but not practically. So Kierkegaard was able to look at contingencies, obstacles, and knew that if we could reflect on them and we can think introspectively, there is a way in which we can overcome these. And he says contradiction and contingency is at the core of our beings. Life is not easy. It will be a struggle. And there he agrees with Schopenhauer. Says, yes, life, of course, is going to be a struggle. And it could look any number of different things. This is why a system can't deal with them. Because the contingency today will look different than, think of the pandemic. 3 years ago, no one even thought of it. There was no such thing. Suddenly along comes something that no system would have predicted, unless you study, biomedics or biomedicine of some sort. No, it's something that literally came out of left field. And the systems all had to twist and turn to accommodate this brand new thing. It was one of the greatest contingencies and obstacles that we have encountered in many, many years. So Kierkegaard says, yeah, if that's the case, a Hegelian system would have been completely useless because there's nothing in the system that reflects the present state of affairs. So if we can understand reflection, we can then turn around and place contradiction and contingency at its very core, acknowledging that they exist, acknowledging that they are going to occur in various forms, but that we can still overcome them. And we can still be able to live a life that is aware of these things. And with that idea, Marx and Engels wrote roughly at the same time. Either War was written in 1843, Thesis on Feuerbach written in 1845, and that is Hegel's famous comment, philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. Without being Marxists, both Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard are thinking the same way. Now, one of the things in which Kierkegaard can be criticized, maybe sort of being unduly harsh towards Hegel, is that he too was picking and selecting certain ideas that would help his system or his way of thinking. And one of the ones that, or one of the critical tools that Hegel did give us was dialectical thinking. And Kierkegaard doesn't really give it its full justice, because Hegel's dialectic is a kind of mediation, right, between the self and the other, the self in external reality, the self in the obstacle, whatever it is, physical, epistemic, logical, whatever it may be. And Hegel, in the same way that contingency and conflict was the core of his concept of the world, Hegel put dialectics as the very condition, right, the very center of any kind of truth. And the way in which you achieve some kind of truth is by asking questions, right? If you continue to formulate and reformulate ideas about the living reality that you're in and trying to grasp the truth as it presently exists, you're doing it dialectically. And what that means is the moment you can find something that is correct and truthful and measurable and verifiable in the world, now that changes your relationship to reality ever so slightly, and you incorporate this new idea in this reformulation of the world. And as you move forward and you overcome and you mediate this obstacle, as you move forward carefully and you move on a foundation of greater and greater truths in the plural, you can overcome some issues. But you have to do it by way of asking questions. And this is something that some critics of Kierkegaard have said, that he didn't give Hegel's dialectical form of thinking really, a greater amount of understanding and contemplation. Now, in his defense, Kierkegaard says that Hegel subordinates individual experiences to the dictates of this very abstract and logical system, which does occur. And so this is kind of where Kierkegaard, certainly what he says has a grain of truth, because we know ultimately everything with Hegel is subsumed, right? It literally is vacuumed up into this abstract system called spirit. Everything fits inside of it. And for Hegel, writing in 1822, which was only roughly 20 years before Kierkegaard, he says, look, the ultimate purpose of this system, and this is something that we should find echoes in Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard. He writes, the I is at home in the world when the I knows it, still more so when it has comprehended it as such. So the I is at home in the world, which is a really important idea in Hegel's work, where peace and happiness and freedom in its fullest manifestation is one in which we see reflected back to us the world that we have imagined. So it really kind of partakes and predates Schopenhauer's idea of the world as will and idea, and it's true, and Kierkegaard's understanding that we live in the world. But Hegel says, yes, of course. The problem is everything, when it finally ends, is still subsumed under the system, but he does take pains to say that the I is at home in the world when it knows it, when it is self-conscious that the world in which it lives is a world that it has created. That's the really important part for Hegel. Now, Any kind of systematic thinking is counterintuitive for Kierkegaard, which is why he writes in the text that's titled Concluding Unscientific Postscripts and Philosophical Fragments. And call it humorous or not, but it is a really, it's a very pointed dig or barb against Hegel and his scientific thinking. So it's like, all right, here's some afterthoughts. Here's some things I thought about, unscientific sort of things to throw in later on, philosophical fragments, right? Not a philosophical system, but philosophical fragments, just chunks of information. Here is some stuff that you can think about. So Kierkegaard, right, missed a point when he argued that Hegel had forgotten in a sort of world historical absent-mindedness what it means to be a human being. But that is still what Hegel, in fact, to a certain degree, Marx then picks up in his early thinking. Hegel still was trying to figure out how individuals can achieve some form of happiness. Some form of happiness it's not the valley between two hills like Schopenhauer, but something that's longer lasting. And anything we do in terms of our pursuit of truth and knowledge should always be done with that in mind. That can we find some permanent form of happiness, that we recognize ourselves in the world, that we have some kind of conscious relationship with perhaps something bigger than ourselves. Even atheists or agnostics can still say, I feel something greater than myself. That is my community, my society, my nation. And this doesn't have to border on nationalism and racism and so on, but just an awareness of being part of something larger. And that is something that Hegel wanted us to think about. Now, he happened to formulate it as a relationship with God, but Kierkegaard wanted us to think of it in formulations of relationships to others, right? Others in our community, in our society. And whether it's a relationship with God, if you're going to do it, it's got to be authentic. It has to be real. So last week we talked very briefly about these transitions to this sort of new form of thinking, the final collapse of metaphysics, the final collapse of systematic thinking. And this is the second transition. This is one that includes Kierkegaard and a little bit Nietzsche that we're going to finish up with next week. And so we are going to try to look at the conceptual tools that individuals had writing in the 1800s, trying to deal with these brand new problems. Okay. So let's take a step back and think about Plato, right? Political thought began when Plato discovered that it is somehow inherent in the philosophical experience to turn away from the common world of human affairs. It ends when nothing was left of this experience but the opposition between thinking and acting, which depriving thought of reality and action of sense makes both meaningless. In the thinking through about politics, and again, politics in Plato's world also includes society, Plato ends up abstracting everything out of it, including human life, human affairs. And it takes until the laws, and even there, it's really more of a code book than it is a way to live. So when Plato begins to think politically, he tries to create this philosophical system that turns away from the authentic world, right? The common world of human affairs. It disappears. And he writes the Republic, which is a parable, right? It's a utopia. It's a metaphor. It's not even talking about real things. Now, Aristotle is much closer to trying to define, for example, the Athenian constitution, which is actually the name of an essay. Plato keeps his feet on the ground. Aristotle keeps his feet on the ground. Plato doesn't. He, in trying to talk about human affairs, ends up abstracting all of it out of the ideas. So Kierkegaard and Marx and Nietzsche challenge a variety of different forms of thinking, whether it's metaphysical thinking, scientific and technological, rational thinking, traditional religion, all of these things. And what they try to do is turn the world on its head, right? That hierarchy of mind over body, it gets turned the other way around. It's body over mind. The individual, not at the expense of the mind, but the other way around. The human, authentic, living subject in the world is what matters. So what Kierkegaard and Marx, and we'll see next week with Nietzsche, is they challenged these assumptions by turning that hierarchy upside down. And they privileged the material world, the sensual world, the authentic world over this ideal world that begins with Plato and carries a tremendous amount of weight for about, almost 1500 years during the Dark Ages, medieval philosophy, where the individual literally doesn't exist. The human subject does not even come into focus until about the 1600s. Now, what happens is neither the 20th century aftermath nor 19th century rebellions really caused that fundamental break in that kind of thinking. So we have these individuals that we looked at last week. We looked at Marx. This week we're looking at Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard. And next week we're going to look at Nietzsche. And each of them, in their own unique way, stand at the end of this philosophical tradition that starts with Plato, metaphysical thinking, abstracting the human experience in formulating ideas and concepts and systems. The human being doesn't exist in any of these systems. And just before this break, the break is really sort of as a result of the early 20th century, the terror of technology, ideology, new forms of domination, totalitarianism, new forms of political entities. All of these finally shatter, completely break apart these types of older traditional forms of thinking. So here is Kierkegaard. Now, they don't predict any of these things. Nietzsche may imply some ideas towards kind of fascistic thinking. But again, let's wait till next week on that. But Kierkegaard, Marx, and Nietzsche stand on the cusp, on the threshold of the break in this kind of thinking. And what ends up happening is actual events in society, in politics, in economics, accelerate that break. So on a theoretical or conceptual level or philosophical level, these thinkers are in this really strange position that totalitarian domination, what ended up happening during the Second World War, this kind of thinking was simply just not there. It just was not there in political thought. And like mythology, right, to the ancient Greeks, it wasn't able to deal with a brand new set of conditions. Mythology couldn't talk about democracy or economics or imperialism. It just talked about stories. It had stories that helped to explain certain aspects of the world. But totalitarian thinking, this is something that is brand new and ultimately very dangerous in the 20th century and still is. It couldn't be comprehended by the traditional categories of social, political, and philosophical thought. And so that eventually is what happens. So those distortions of the traditions, the philosophical tradition, Kierkegaard, in his leap of faith, saying that just take the leap because that's as far as reason can take you, and now you need to move over and jump into faith. So jumping from doubt to belief, right? It brought into play attacks on modern science and religion, a struggle within religion, because some people weren't willing to make the leap. So along with changes in behavior, changes in political systems, movements towards totalitarianism and this kind of totalizing thinking, this is all brand new for philosophy. And the last three philosophers who try to deal with this, they're doing it with old tools, right? Old critical tools. So modern science becomes a much more powerful enemy of religion, becomes a kind of enemy where there isn't really the tools in traditional philosophy to explain it. And in fact, it moves much further down the road in terms of being an enemy of religion than traditional philosophy ever was. And yet here's Kierkegaard trying to use traditional philosophical tools to save religion, to save faith, and try to salvage this thing that he believes still possibly could exist in modernity. And, if you can doubt it and distrust it, the moment you start doing that and applying these possibilities, religion really is on kind of shaky ground, because we have a brand new social and economic condition in which religion is living. Modern science and technology in particular really is the new religion, because technology really is everything. It's created wars. It's created advances in transportation and medicine and everything. Science is it. Science is the new religion. And Kierkegaard can't deal with it, because when he talks about faith and religion, he's talking about the old-fashioned way. So traditional beliefs begin to disintegrate. Kierkegaard is aware of it. And when he calls it out as, well, people aren't real believers, right? They just go through the motions. It's true, but didn't pick up on the fact that modern science and technology and capitalism and industrialization, they were the reasons why people were losing faith. That's what social enemy is, right? Losing that deep connection with the community, with others, and kind of being free-floating, not really sure how to move forward. And again, social enemy would have to rely on introspection, compassion, to be able to navigate through this brand new world. But certainly here, traditional beliefs disintegrate and just literally fall apart. Kierkegaard tries to reassert them, thinking that if you can just simply believe more deeply, then you'll be fine. But it's clearly going to take more than that, right? It's that much more difficult to be religious. Now, there is a swing back, there has been for perhaps the last 20 or 30 years, towards this kind of thinking. But traditional beliefs, as Kierkegaard saw them, just were no longer possible. And then ultimately, there is this kind of self-defeat that each of these thinkers experience, because their ideas try to move things forward, but are using it trying to achieve this using old tools. So they are rebellious against traditional forms of philosophy, and it's true. They talk about the abstracting aspect of idealist philosophy. They talk about concepts of humanity that really don't fit in well with the contingencies of human life. Kierkegaard wanted to also assert, suffering individuals, and that's true. But there were a whole range of different possibilities to fix that problem, when in fact, other things were far more important and far more influential and totalizing. Technology and industry being, along with capitalism, being probably three of the most powerful entities that philosophy couldn't fight against. Science and technology and industry were winning the war, not just the battles, but the war. And so we have these three thinkers using the conceptual tools of traditional philosophy to fight a brand new enemy, right? Modernity. So that is Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard. And we'll wrap up these transitions next week. And when it comes to sort of its final culmination in the thoughts of Nietzsche. So in the meantime, hopefully we'll see each other this week for a Zoom meeting. And hopefully this was inspiring and eye-opening. Certainly very practical forms of philosophy, but very much part of the history of. So see you next week and later this week for Zoom. Take care then. Bye-bye.